The day had started like any other, with the man sitting at his kitchen table sipping his morning coffee while sunlight spilled through the blinds. He had always enjoyed this quiet moment of calm before work, the hum of the refrigerator in the background, the faint sound of birds outside, everything feeling steady and normal. But when he picked up the stack of mail lying on the counter, his peaceful rhythm cracked. Among the envelopes was his monthly electricity bill, printed with the familiar logo of the utility company. He tore it open casually, expecting the usual number, nothing shocking, nothing unusual. Yet when his eyes landed on the total, his hand froze and the cup of coffee nearly slipped from his fingers. The numbers stared back at him, far higher than they had ever been. His brows knitted, disbelief flooding him as he read the amount again and again. It wasn't just a little higher, it was double, almost triple what he usually paid. His heart raced, his mind spinning with confusion. Had he left appliances running? Was there a fault in the system? He shook his head slowly, because nothing in his routine had changed. He was careful about lights, careful with the air conditioning, and he hadn't bought any new devices. Something was wrong, badly wrong. He placed the bill on the table and leaned back, staring at the ceiling as frustration churned in his chest. It made no sense. Electricity did not simply spike overnight without reason. He rubbed his temples and tried to think logically. Perhaps the company had made a mistake? Perhaps the meter had been misread? He decided he would check it himself later, but as he glanced toward the wall where the wires ran into his house, a strange unease crawled into his thoughts. What if it wasn't the company at all? What if someone else was pulling from his line? He brushed the thought away quickly, telling himself it was ridiculous. Still, the nagging suspicion clung to him like a shadow. That evening, after dinner, he stepped outside with a flashlight to check the meter on the side of his house. He crouched down, the beam of light cutting through the dusk, and studied the numbers. They spun faster than he expected, almost unnaturally fast for the hour, as if something unseen was devouring power while the neighborhood slept. He frowned, standing slowly, his eyes scanning the yard. The night was calm, houses dark around him, nothing out of the ordinary. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere close, something was feeding off his electricity. He sighed, returning inside, but sleep came restless that night. He tossed and turned, the image of the fast-spinning meter haunting his mind. When morning came, his eyes were heavy, but his resolve sharper. Something was happening, and he would find out what. The next evening the man sat again at his kitchen table, the strange bill lying in front of him like an enemy taunting him, and he could not ignore it any longer. His instincts told him that the power was being drained not by accident but by something deliberate. He poured himself a glass of water, took a deep breath, and decided to investigate more carefully. When the sun went down and the neighborhood grew quiet, he slipped outside with his flashlight, his boots crunching softly against the gravel, and he walked the edges of his yard. At first everything looked normal, the porch light glowing faintly, the grass swaying in the breeze, but then he noticed something odd, a faint hum near the side of his garage, a low vibration almost hidden by the sound of crickets. He crouched down, pressing his ear closer, and there it was again, steady and unnatural, like electricity flowing where it should not. His eyes followed the sound and then he saw it, a thick extension cord snaking away from his outlet, hidden partly under the hedge, stretching across the yard toward the fence that divided his property from the next. His chest tightened as he followed it slowly, careful not to make a sound, and the beam of his flashlight revealed the truth. The cord ran straight across into Karen's yard, slipping through a gap in the boards, disappearing toward her driveway. Shock slammed into him like cold water. He froze, gripping the flashlight tighter, his breath caught in his throat. It was not a faulty meter, not a mistake by the power company. It was theft, plain and simple, and the thief was none other than Karen, the woman who had spent years lording her power over the community with her endless rules and threats. Anger rose in him hot and fierce, but he forced himself to stay calm. He followed the faint glow of blue light until his eyes caught the shape in her driveway, sleek and shiny under the moonlight, her Tesla, plugged in and charging silently. His jaw clenched so hard it hurt. She was stealing from him, stealing to feed her luxury car, while she fined neighbors for grass too long and paint too bright. He stood there in the dark, his fists trembling at his sides, part of him wanting to rip the cord out immediately and shout loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear. But another part of him, the colder part, told him to wait, to be smart. He turned off the flashlight and walked back to his porch, his thoughts sharp as blades. Karen thought she was clever, thought no one would notice the little cord hidden under hedges, thought her Tesla would drink power night after night without consequence. But she had underestimated him. Sitting back in his chair, he stared at the bill again, the outrageous number now making perfect sense, and a grim smile spread across his face. He knew what she was doing, he had seen it with his own eyes, and now it was only a matter of time before she realized she had made the worst mistake of her life. The next morning the man woke up earlier than usual, his mind still replaying the image of that thick extension cord running from his outlet into Karen's yard, the memory of her Tesla sitting there smug and silent as it drank his power fueling a steady fire in his chest. He brewed coffee but barely tasted it, every sip bitter because all he could think about was the arrogance it must take for her to pull such a stunt. As the sun climbed higher, he walked outside slowly, pretending it was just another morning stroll. But really his eyes were fixed on Karen's driveway. There it was, gleaming under the light, her pride and joy, the shiny Tesla, its silver body polished so clean it mirrored the sky. She was already outside too, standing by it with her phone in hand, glancing occasionally toward his house with that same smug confidence she wore at every HOA meeting. He felt the heat rising in him, but he forced his face to remain calm, his steps steady as he walked past her yard. The faint green light on the charging port still glowed, mocking him with every blink. For a moment their eyes met, and she gave him a tight smile, one that carried no friendliness, only arrogance, as if she already knew he would never dare to challenge her. He clenched his jaw, keeping his silence, and moved on, but inside he was boiling. By the time he returned to his porch, his hands were shaking with the urge to confront her, to shout across the street that he knew exactly what she was doing. But a voice in his head told him to wait, to think carefully, because exposing her without proof could backfire. He sat down, his gaze locked on the Tesla shimmering in the distance, and every neighbor that passed seemed to glance at it too, admiration in their eyes, unaware of the secret theft behind its shine. He thought of the outrageous bill lying on his kitchen table, the hours of electricity stolen night after night, and the idea of Karen smugly plugging her car into his power outlet filled him with a cold determination. This wasn't about money anymore, it was about respect, about the principle of being robbed in plain sight by the very woman who spent her days punishing others for petty violations. He knew Karen loved her Tesla more than anything, it was her symbol of status, her way of showing she was above everyone else, and that realization gave him the sharp edge of an idea. If she depended on his stolen power to keep it alive, then she had placed her pride directly in his hands, and she didn't even know it. He leaned back slowly in his chair, the faint smile returning to his lips, and whispered to himself that soon Karen would regret underestimating him, because while she believed she held all the control in the neighborhood, she had just handed him the one weakness that could bring her crashing down. That afternoon the man finally decided he could not hold his silence any longer. The sight of his bill, the image of that cord, and the glow of Karen's Tesla had all piled up like fuel waiting for a spark, so he crossed the street and walked straight to her yard. Karen was there again, watering her flowers with a plastic smile on her face, the same fake friendliness she always used before cutting someone down with a rule violation. She noticed him coming and stiffened slightly, but she kept her chin high, as if daring him to speak. He stopped just short of her driveway, his voice calm but firm as he asked, "Karen, why is there a cord running from my outlet to your house?" Her eyes widened for the smallest second, but then her expression hardened into a mask of denial. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said smoothly, her tone dripping with arrogance. "If your bill is high, maybe you should check your appliances. Don't come here trying to blame me." He stared at her, unblinking, and replied, "I saw it myself. The cord runs under the hedge, into your yard, straight to your car." Karen's lips curled into a smirk as she set down her watering can and folded her arms. "Really? You're accusing me of stealing power? That's slander, and I could report you to the HOA for harassment. Do you want me to do that?" His fists tightened at his sides, but he kept his voice level. "Report me if you want, but it won't change the truth. She stepped closer, her voice rising so neighbors peeking through curtains could hear. The truth is you're trying to cause trouble. Everyone knows you're difficult. Maybe you don't want to follow the rules, maybe you think you're special, but you are not above the HOA. If you keep bothering me, I will make sure the board fines you until you learn your lesson. The man felt his pulse quicken, anger surging through him, but he forced himself not to explode. He realized in that moment she was playing a game, twisting the situation to make him look like the villain, using threats of the HOA as her shield. He could almost hear her smug laughter inside her head, believing he would back down like so many others had before. But he was not like them. He leaned closer, his voice low but steady enough for her to hear every word. I know what you're doing. And soon everyone else will know too. Her smirk faltered for just a heartbeat, a flicker of unease in her eyes, but she quickly turned away, pretending to arrange her flowers. Get off my property, she snapped, louder this time, putting on her performance again. And don't come back unless you want a violation notice. He stepped back slowly, never breaking eye contact until the last moment, then turned and walked away, his chest tight with fury but his mind already sharpening with resolve. She thought denial and threats would scare him off, but all they had done was confirm her guilt, and now he was more determined than ever to catch her in the act. By the time he reached his porch, the anger had cooled into focus, and he whispered to himself that if Karen wanted to play games, he would show her how games were really played. That night the man sat on his porch with the house lights dimmed, his eyes fixed on the dark line of hedges that separated his yard from Karen's, the memory of her smirk replaying in his mind like a challenge. She had denied everything, threatened him with the HOA, and spoken loud enough for the neighbors to hear, twisting the truth as if she were untouchable. But he knew what he had seen, he knew the cord was real, and now he was determined to catch her in the act with proof no one could deny. He went inside, rummaged through a drawer, and pulled out a small camera he had used years ago for security. It was old but reliable, motion-activated with night vision. He tested it, watching the red light blink steadily, and felt a grim satisfaction. Tonight would be different. Tonight he would stop doubting and start recording. Just before midnight he slipped outside quietly, careful with every step, the cool air brushing against his skin as he crouched near the garage. He mounted the camera where it had a clear view of his outlet and the path of the hedge, hidden just enough in the shadows so no one would notice. Then he went back inside, turned off the lights, and waited. The house was silent, the ticking of the clock louder than usual, his heart beating with every second. He sat near the window where he could see faint movement across the street. Hours dragged on, the night stretching endlessly, until finally he saw it, Karen. She moved quietly, a hoodie pulled over her head as if she was some kind of thief in the night, glancing around nervously before crouching near the hedge. The man's eyes narrowed as he saw the glint of the extension cord in her hands. She moved quickly, plugging it into his outlet with practiced ease, then straightening and slipping back across her yard, her Tesla waiting like a silent beast in the driveway. The green light blinked on its charging port, and the faint hum returned, the sound that had haunted him before. His blood boiled at the sight, but he didn't move. He didn't shout. He only smiled coldly to himself because this time the camera had captured everything. He let her go, let her think she had succeeded again, because patience would deliver him something louder than confrontation. Proof undeniable, proof that would destroy her lies. By the time dawn crept in, he retrieved the camera, carried it inside, and loaded the footage on his computer. The screen flickered, and there she was, clear as day despite the darkness, sneaking across his yard, stealing his power, feeding her Tesla with his electricity. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his eyes locked on the frozen image of Karen caught red-handed. For the first time since the strange bill had arrived, he felt the weight lift from his chest, replaced with a sharper, stronger resolve. She had tried to humiliate him, she had tried to deny the truth, but now he had everything he needed to turn the tables. Karen thought she was clever, but the man whispered to himself that her game was over, because now the hunter had become the hunted. The man sat at his desk the next evening with the camera footage replaying on his screen, each frame of Karen sneaking across his yard feeding the fire in his chest, but instead of rushing to confront her, He leaned back slowly and let his mind sharpen. Proof was powerful, yes, but punishment was sweeter when it came with precision. He stared at the outlet on the side of his house through the window, imagining her smug face as she plugged into it, imagining the green glow of her Tesla charging at his expense, and a cold idea began to form in his head. He stood, walked into his workshop at the back of the house, and flicked on the light. The shelves were lined with tools, wires, and parts collected over the years, reminders of his habit of fixing things himself. His hands moved steadily as he pulled out coils of insulated wire, a spare breaker switch, and a small surge device. He laid them out carefully on the workbench, each piece part of the trap forming in his mind. Karen thought she could steal power forever, but she had never considered that her theft could be turned into her downfall. He began to work, stripping wires, connecting circuits, fitting the breaker so it would snap instantly under a surge. The setup wasn't dangerous enough to hurt anyone, he was too smart for that, but it would fry anything plugged in without proper grounding, and her Tesla charger fit that description perfectly. Hours passed as he soldered connections, tested the current, adjusted the timing until the circuit behaved exactly as he wanted. His eyes gleamed with satisfaction when the final test popped a small bulb instantly, the breaker tripping with a sharp click. He reset it, smiling coldly to himself. This was no longer just about catching her. It was about teaching her the lesson she deserved. Near midnight he installed the device on his outdoor outlet, sealing it carefully so it looked unchanged, the trap waiting silently in the dark. Then he returned to his porch, sat with his arms crossed, and let the night grow still. He could almost feel her coming, almost hear the faint shuffle of her steps before she even appeared. Sure enough, close to 1 a.m, the shadow of Karen moved across his yard. She wore the same hoodie, her head jerking nervously as she crouched at the outlet, sliding the plug in with practiced arrogance. For a second, everything looked normal. The green light blinked on her Tesla across the street, the faint hum of power flowing into it. But then it happened. A spark jumped from the cord, a sharp crack split the silence, and the glow on her car's port flickered violently before shutting off completely. Karen gasped, stumbling back, staring at the cord in shock as smoke curled faintly from the outlet. She yanked the plug out, shaking her head in disbelief, glancing around wildly as if she feared someone had seen her. The man stayed hidden in the shadows of his porch, his lips curling into a grim smile. The circuit had worked perfectly, frying her setup without harming the outlet, leaving her standing there stunned and powerless. She fumbled with the cord, tried plugging it back in, but nothing happened. The breaker had already killed the flow. Panic flickered in her eyes as she hurried across the yard, dragging the cord behind her like a thief caught in the act. The Tesla sat dark and silent, its charging port dead, her prized possession drained of its lifeline. The man leaned back slowly, satisfaction coursing through him. She would not know how, she would not know when, but she would know the truth, that her arrogance had met its match. And this was only the beginning, because while the circuit had shut down her theft, the footage in his possession would finish the job for good. That night the neighborhood slept in silence, but the man sat on his porch with the shadows wrapped around him, his eyes fixed on the hedges where he knew Karen would appear again because arrogance was a habit she could never let go of, and true to his thoughts the faint shuffle of footsteps came near midnight. He saw her dark shape moving carefully across the lawn, the cord coiled in her hands, her head turning nervously as if she feared being caught but had greed too strong to resist. She crouched at his outlet, plugged it in quickly, and for a second she grinned with smug relief when the green light flickered on her Tesla. But the trap was waiting, silent and unseen, and then the night cracked with a sharp spark. A hiss of smoke curled from the cord, a pop echoed against the siding of the house, and her grin vanished as she yelped, jerking back in shock. She pulled at the cord frantically, but the breaker had already tripped, leaving the line dead and her charger fried. The Tesla across the street went dark, its charging light blinking once, twice, then shutting off completely as if the life had been sucked from it. Karen stood frozen for a moment, staring in disbelief, her face pale under the faint glow of the street lamp. She shook the cord, cursed it under her breath, tried plugging it back in, but each time nothing happened. She slapped the side of the outlet with her palm, her frustration spilling out in angry mutters, before dragging the cord back toward her yard with quick, angry steps. The man watched silently, his lips curling into a smile of satisfaction. Every second of her panic carved into his memory. She glanced once toward his porch, suspicion flickering in her eyes, but the darkness hid him well and she turned away, stomping back to her driveway where her precious Tesla now sat useless, its battery low and its pride wounded. He leaned back in his chair, breathing slow, his heart steady with triumph. The trap had worked exactly as planned, not dangerous but humiliating, enough to make her fear that her clever scheme had backfired. He imagined her inside her house, pacing, fuming, too afraid to admit what had happened because it would mean confessing to the theft she had denied so boldly before. By morning the whispers began to stir. Neighbors noticed her car not moving, noticed her nervous glances, noticed that something had gone wrong with the woman who always boasted about being in control. A few laughed quietly among themselves, others guessed at mechanical trouble, but the man stayed silent, letting the rumors grow. He knew Karen's pride would never allow her to admit the truth, and that was the sweetest part. Her silence was his victory. And as he poured his morning coffee, he whispered to himself that this was only the shock before the storm, because soon she would face more than a dead charger. She would face the truth exposed before everyone would be why the next morning the entire neighborhood felt different. The air buzzing with whispers as if news traveled faster than the wind itself, because Karen's Tesla, the pride of her driveway, sat silent and powerless for all to see. The man watched from his porch as neighbors passed by on their morning walks, some slowing down to glance at the car, others nudging each other with knowing smirks, their voices low but filled with amusement. One man walking his dog muttered that it was strange the car hadn't moved since yesterday. Another woman whispered to her friend that she had seen sparks in the night near Karen's yard. And soon the small stories began blending into one louder tale. The queen of the HOA had lost control of her toy. The man sipped his coffee, listening carefully, saying nothing, but every word added fuel to his quiet satisfaction. By afternoon the whispers turned into laughter behind closed doors. A group of teens rode their bikes past Karen's house, pointing at the Tesla and laughing loudly, their voices carrying down the street. Even the older residents, the ones Karen had bullied for years with fines and warnings, now allowed themselves a smile when they saw her pacing in her driveway, phone in hand, trying to look calm while her face betrayed her frustration. She spoke loudly on the phone, claiming it was a technical glitch, claiming the charger company had messed up, but no one believed her. They could see the tightness in her jaw, the nervous tapping of her foot, the way she avoided eye contact. For once, Karen was not the enforcer, she was the joke. The man kept to himself, working quietly in his yard, but he noticed neighbors glancing at him differently too, a subtle respect in their eyes, as if they suspected he had something to do with the sudden shift. No one asked directly, but the silence between them carried an unspoken understanding. By evening small groups had gathered at corners, families talking openly instead of whispering in fear, and the subject was always the same, Karen's downfall. Some told stories of her past arrogance, how she fined a family for leaving out trash cans a few minutes late, how she threatened a widow for planting flowers without permission. And now those same voices laughed freely because her Tesla sat dead like a monument to her hypocrisy. The man listened from his porch as the laughter echoed through the neighborhood, a sound sweeter than music. Karen had built her power on intimidation, but now the people were no longer afraid. They were entertained by her struggles, and once laughter replaced fear there was no way for her to rebuild her throne. She stormed into her house just before sunset, slamming the door so hard the sound carried down the street, but the damage was already done. The man leaned back in his chair, the sky turning orange above him, and whispered to himself that the neighborhood had finally tasted freedom, and once they had tasted it, they would never let Karen choke them with fear again. The HOA meeting came a week later and by then the neighborhood was already humming with energy. People who had once avoided these gatherings now filled the clubhouse to the brim, whispering, laughing quietly, waiting for the show everyone knew was coming. The man arrived last, walking calmly with a folder tucked under his arm, his eyes steady as he scanned the room. Karen was already at the front table, her Tesla key fob clutched tight in her hand like a nervous tick, her clipboard stacked with papers she kept shuffling though she never read them. She wore a forced smile, but the tightness around her eyes betrayed her unease. When she banged the gavel to start the meeting, her voice trembled despite her best effort to sound firm. This meeting, she declared, is to address the recent spread of lies and harassment against your HOA leadership. Certain individuals are attempting to cause division, and I will not tolerate it." She lifted her chin proudly, her eyes darting toward the man in the back, but the crowd was restless. Murmurs rose, questions whispered, and for the first time people weren't looking at her with obedience but with doubt. A neighbor stood up boldly and asked why the HOA funds were missing from last quarter's report. Another demanded to know why projects they had paid for never materialized. Karen stuttered, her face flushing red as she snapped back that it was none of their concern, but the voices grew louder. That was when the man stood. Silence fell almost instantly, the weight of expectation thick in the room. He walked to the front slowly, placed his folder on the table, and opened it with deliberate calm. "If it's lies you're worried about," he said in a steady voice, "then let's show everyone the truth." He pulled out the printed photographs from his camera, clear shots of Karen sneaking across his yard, plugging her cord into his outlet, her Tesla glowing smugly as it fed off his electricity. Gasps echoed around the room. Karen shot up from her chair, shouting that it was fake, that it was edited, but her voice cracked, thin and desperate. He raised a hand, silencing her. "You can deny it all you want," he said coldly, "but the camera doesn't lie. You stole power. You lied to your neighbors. You used your position to threaten and bully while feeding yourself." The room erupted with angry shouts, people rising to their feet, pointing fingers, their voices filled with years of frustration finally set free. Some demanded she resign, others yelled that she should be reported to the authorities, and Karen's mask finally broke. Her shoulders sagged, her face pale, the clipboard slipping from her trembling hands as she looked around and saw no allies left, no one to defend her. The man gathered his papers back into his folder, his voice cutting through the storm one last time. "You claimed to represent the rules, but rules don't excuse theft. You claimed to protect this community, but you drained it instead. That ends today." The crowd roared with applause, louder than any meeting had ever heard, clapping, cheering, their voices united. Karen stumbled back, her lips moving but no words coming out, her reign crumbling in front of everyone. The man turned and walked out of the clubhouse calmly, the cheers following him into the night. Outside, the air felt lighter, the sky wide and free above him. For the first time in years the neighborhood belonged not to fear but to its people again, and behind him the once untouchable Karen sat broken, her empire of lies fried just like the circuit she thought she could steal from.